So maybe what?
Yeah, no, I think this is good here, but maybe
I don't have Jeff's
stand up
number,
here so we can
but
back the car up a little bit. Or we just want to do it right here.
It's just running.
Back up. I mean, we don't have to have a chapter one of my life, and it's online. And you got the link. You can go out and see it on Grandpa's genealogy page.
this is also Tima's grandpa and great grandpa. Just so you know, these two are
Yeah.
siblings.
Okay? Tima. She's my sister. Okay? Baby sister. Bratty little sister. Yeah, that's who it is. So, Grandpa came out here when he was 25. Who's 25 here? Who's the closest to 25?
Probably me.
So as a healthy young man,
This would be closest to crew.
okay, Grandpa is living in Ohio working in the steel mills. His parents had come over from Wales. And so first generation from Wales, they were in the coal mines there. The Welsh are famous for two things. They're coal miners and they're short. So Davis jeans are shorter. That's because you fit in the mines better. He came out, his wife, Grandpa's mother, died of consumption when Grandpa was only 6. Do you know what consumption is? I know Terry does. The modern term for it is tuberculosis. So if you've watched Wyatt Earp, you know who Doc Holliday is. That's what he died from, was consumption. That's what everybody had. It was a very popular disease in the 1800s. So great grandma had that, and she died out in the orchard out behind the house coughing. And one day, Dad came in and just says, Grandma's not with us anymore. And my grandpa was 6 at that time. So who's 6 here?
Izzy.
Who's close? All right, that's how old he was. He was raised at that point by an older sister, a couple of boys, and that was life. Every day when Grandpa, his dad, would cook up a great big pot of mush, oatmeal, porridge, pick your term. But this great big batch of that, one splat on your bowl was what you had for breakfast. Then they had these metal coal miner lunch buckets. They were kind of a circular, about yay long. That's what everybody took down into the mines. Every one of the kids had one of those, and he'd take that one splat of mush in the bottom of that, hand it to you, and off you went to school. That's what you had for lunch. And he says, I didn't know for years that wasn't just a normal mush that you ate with 2 fingers for, you know, your brunch when you were at school. That's what I had. And he said, then these other kids showed up with other stuff. And he said, where did that come from? So that's how he was raised. And he was working in the steel mills. His older brother one day got sick of it and said, I'm out of here. I don't care where I'm going. I'm out of here. Bought a train ticket to the end of the line, St. Anthony, Idaho. That was as far as it went. From there, you took a stagecoach to go to Yellowstone. If you take the old road up past Ashton, up to Mesa Falls, that's the stagecoach road that took you up to Yellowstone. So he got a ticket to there, got out and looked around and said, I've died and gone to heaven.
Just a second. She's got a question. How old was Hugh when he made that decision to leave Ohio?
Just a couple of years older.
22?
Yeah, I'd say. I can't give you a number.
And do we have a journal
Nothing.
reading that that's really why he came here?
I've never read a thing except his comments. And so he turned right around and telegraphed Grandpa and said, get your butt out here. And so he came, I don't even know how much later than that, but came out by himself. He wasn't married. He wasn't a member. These guys are not LDS at all. And he said, I'm going to come out here. And so they homesteaded, and he got this ground out here as a government grant. And I don't even know if it was 640 or 320 acres.
Will you tell them what homestead it is?
Homestead was where the government, the U.S. government, wanted the West settled. And the best way to do it is to give you free ground. And so it was basically in plots, parts of a township, which is 640 acres, was usually the minimum that you got. That's a big chunk. But the way that they farmed this is dry farm. There was no sprinkler system, there was no water, period. You relied on rain. And so they would plow the fields with horses and plant the wheat and wait for the summer to go. And at the end of the summer, you'd go out and harvest what grain there was, and that was your crop. That was dry farming. And that's the way, even up on the Rexburg bench, people farmed when I was this age. There was no water, no wells, no pivot systems. Irrigation obviously isn't going to work that high up. So that was the normal way, and that's what he did. That was in 1910 when he came out. Okay, 9 years later, he's been up here he's got 8 head of horses that he has that pull the plows, some cows for milk, and that's life, and he's batching it. And he's now 34, and the flu hits. Now, you guys have gone through COVID. COVID was pussycat compared to what influenza was in 1918, 19. A third of the world was sick. We lost, 6 million on COVID. We lost 500 million in the flu because there was nothing, they didn't know what it was. Medicine, I mean, I know what Terry knows in terms of her medicine. She's a genius compared to what those poor people had back then. Even penicillin, as simple as that is, didn't exist until after World War I, so 1920. So these guys didn't have even penicillin. More people died in World War I from infections of any kind than from bullets. It was infection that got you because there was nothing to help you. So the flu was that way. Okay, Grandpa's living down here in the cabin. Let me show you what the cabin looks like. Okay, there's the cabin. You can pass that around. And this is another view of the cabin. Take that. How'd you like to live in that?
And he built this with you?
He built that all by himself.
Not with you?
No, just these trees and everything else. This is all by himself when he's this age.
We call it a cabin, but it was home.
It was home.
Of his house.
There's one more view of it. This is the corrals. This is where the animals were kept. That's just a separate building. It was right there. Okay, Grandpa's living there and somehow gets the flu. We don't know how this happened because he wasn't in contact with people. I mean, he was absolutely alone for most of the time. But he gets the flu, and a guy who is selling wood, who is just a wood hauler, is going through from cabin, farm to farm at this time, just saying, what can I do for you, how you doing, blah, 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 and didn't see smoke coming out and was curious, so he came over to the cabin, and Grandpa was on the floor in a coma. He had 5 days worth of growth, and so they figure he'd been out for 5 days because Grandpa was pretty fastidious and shaved every day with an old straight razor. But they said he looked horrible, and this guy threw him in a buckboard and drove him to St. Anthony. Now, the road that you just came up, if you want to get in a buckboard and go all the way to St. Anthony,
What's a buckboard?
a simple wagon pulled by a couple of horses.
And what time of the year was this again, Uncle Rick? If he's got the flu,
Late
this
fall.
guy's selling wood,
Late fall.
then he's in a cold wagon with the flu.
Yeah.
He's in
Details.
Coma, it doesn't matter.
They, yeah. So
He
they,
doesn't know.
so they took him to St. Anthony. Now, second part of this chapter, here's Grandma. His wife-to-be is a blue blood out of Utah. Her mother is a smoot, a bean smoot, and that's money, that's fancy in the valley down there.
Just so you know, Smoot is BYU.
True.
That's BYU.
Smoot buildings, all that stuff. That's your family.
That's us.
That's great. He was a polygamist. He had 2 wives, and one wife wanted to stay in Utah, and the other one said, I want to go up to Idaho. And so she came with her kids, and she had 6 girls. And Grandma was one of those girls. So they came up here. Grandma was, they were smart. It was a very educated, but just a smart family. She went to BYU in 1906, I think, graduated from BYU Academy at a time when women were supposed to be home washing dishes and having babies, and that's the end of it. And she wanted an education. She was absolutely, who the heck are you? But she was a pusher that way. Grandma was always a pusher. Grandma did not live in the kitchen. Grandma did not bake cookies. She was a brain. So she had been asked to be the school superintendent. She'd been teaching school in Utah and clear down into Moab. And then the school district in Fremont County found her, looked her up, and said, "We want you to come up here and run the schools from here to Yellowstone." Okay, says Grandma, and she took it on. And she was doing that when the flu hit. Well, they closed everything, just like they did for COVID, and so the school became a hospital. And all they did in the hospital, they didn't have anything, this is just take care of you. Now, back up. Florence Nightingale is 1850s, 10 years before the American Civil War. Florence Nightingale is famous as being a nurse. What is a nurse? All she did was sweep the floors and give you a clean bed to sleep in. That was her nursing capabilities. There was no medicine whatsoever. It's in the Crimean Wars down on the coast of Turkey. And it was English that we're talking about here. But the start of medicine in the mid-1800s is just the start. Nothing happens. Surgeries are done in a suit. There's no comprehension at all of cleanliness. You wore the same coat that you'd
The
worn.
more blood you had on you, the better.
The better it was. No anesthesia. The Arabs had anesthesia. The Greeks had anesthesia, but we didn't. You just suck it up and let me cut this out. And if you lived, fine. But the morbidity rate was about 80%. There's a guy named Lister who was a doctor up in Scotland. He took carbolic acid and diluted it and sprayed everything down with it. And he said, "I think that this will help," because they were working on a cadaver. I mean, if you got an appendectomy that I've got to do, and here's this guy right here groaning because I've got to do an appendectomy. I had a corpse right here, and I'd say, okay, I'm going to cut here, and it's gross, it's all rotted and everything else, but okay. Then I turn right around, open you up, and go to work. Duh. So he sprayed everything down, and guess what? People started to live. So somebody said, I don't know what it is. This is about when Pasteur gets a microscope and discovers wee beasties, is what he calls them, bacterium. And we start to see the whole start of medicine. Okay, that's Grandma's heritage. So now we're in this hospital, quote unquote, in St. Anthony, and she is just one more lady who's been called to be a nurse, whatever that means, and she said they're bringing a guy in from Canyon Creek more dead than alive. And sorry, she was assigned to him, and they just threw him in the bed, and they said, "What do I do?" She said, "Rub his back, just do anything that you can," because he was in a coma. Grandma had terribly rough hands, just sandpaper hands. And Grandpa would tell the story. He said, "I was happy, I was sleeping, and then the fires of hell were on my back." He said, "I don't know what it was, but I had to get out of there." So he revived.
That's what brought him out of the coma, right?
That's what brought him out. Ka-ching, the Florence Nightingale syndrome kicks in, and that's how they met. So here is there's the picture of them dating. That's the summer that they're both in their 30s. I think Grandpa's
She was
30.
31 when she married him,
31, and he's 34, I think, at the time.
which is pretty old for.
Both of them. Both of them.
And what's this building behind him?
That's a house in St. Anthony.
Okay.
That's just a house.
Do you have any idea where this stands
house is?
now in St. Anthony? I mean,
No.
I know it's no longer there, but
I don't
even
have an
general
address.
location.
Not that. So that's how they get together. At that point, what are we going to do? So they get married in Teton and come up here. They take a buckboard and I think she said 4 bushels of peaches, put them in the back, and drive up here for their honeymoon and for the summer, blah, blah, blah. And so that's how life starts. They would come up here in the summer, they would farm, whatever, and then go back down to Teton, which is where her family was. The Beans were in Teton area. And she would spend the winters with them, or she went clear back to Utah again for more schooling and to teach. Grandpa just stayed in town. Grandpa was a carpenter. His dad was a carpenter. And so he would do odd jobs, just fixing up somebody's back porch, doing whatever.
Now, hang on one second. So they were here in the summer. They went to Rexburg in the winter.
Teton.
Teton. Do we know where in Teton?
Just south of Teton is where the Beans were, out as you're coming from Sugar City to Teton, and you're out there on the flat where the gravel pits are.
Yeah, it's gonna say it's northeast of her house.
Yes, yes.
Little
On the
northeast.
river bottoms before you get into Teton on your right.
Yeah.
Is that, so well, they said there used to be an island.
Not
yeah,
much.
They call it the island, but
Was that in the same area or no?
Grandma hated it because of the mosquitoes. She said as a girl growing up that the mosquitoes were so bad because they're down in the willow bottoms. But she said that she felt sorry for the pigs. No, this would be Grandma
Well, actually,
Josie's
it's Annie.
mother.
It's Annie.
Annie,
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Pincock.
Yeah.
And they lived in this cabin down there. She says the pigs would be covered with mosquitoes and would run down and flop into the mud and roll around in it just to get them some protection. But when they would flop down, stand up again, their side would be red from all the smashed mosquitoes. She said they just squeal because of all these mosquitoes. The other thing she hated was rain because the cabin that they were in had a sod roof. And
would
she
be
wanted it
improved.
clean, so they bleached a big piece of muslin and hung it. So you had this nice white ceiling in the house, but then when it would rain, there'd be drips. And there'd be a brown spot, brown spot, brown spot, and her mother'd say, take it down and bleach it and put it back up again. Dang it. So that was life there. Here's a picture of them on the farm. And it's crazy to think that Grandma Margaret, who was such a city gal, fell in love with life up here on the farm. The big farmers had that kind of a deal. That's 30, I don't know how many head of horses, so I got it written on there. What does it say?
32.
32 head of horses to pull a combine. I'd like to be in charge of leading those 32 head, make sure that they're going straight down the row.
How would you like to plow this ground up to make it farmable?
Exactly.
Because this is what it was.
And so here's the one that Grandpa had, and he's on there. He's the one over on the left-hand side. That's Grandpa. And that's how primitive the combines were, the whole process. If they were putting up hay, it was like this, and that's Grandpa. And an old girlfriend who came out from Ohio to see him, and Grandma was bummed because she came out in spite of their being married. She says, what are you doing here anyway? Okay, water. Let me tell you about water for a minute. The only water, the cabin's over there, the only water is up here. And there was no way except taking a water wagon, which is that. Now,
There was one of those at Virginia City this Monday.
So it'd be out of Pony Creek that they were
at a
going
Pony Creek. So here's the trick. You guys all know this, but why do race cars go faster than an SUV? Why can they go around the corner faster? Low center of gravity. That's the secret. Okay, look at that picture and tell me where the center of gravity is. Mile in the air. And think how heavy water is. That's very heavy. So it was a real tricky deal to take that wagon up there. It took a day to fill it, just to let it sit there and gradually fill because it was a slow creek. And then to drive that thing back down the road to the house. And that was the only water that there was until it was empty 2 weeks later. So Grandma grew up incredibly frugal with water. Nothing was wasted. Okay, for baths, at the end of the day, when everybody came in at the end of the day, if there was any washing that had been done, that water was saved and the men washed in that first because they were filthy dirty. The kids and everybody else, Dad talked about this, but you would stand in a wash tub, and it was from the oldest to the youngest, and Dad hated that. He was the middle child, so it meant that he got dirty water. But you'd stand there and they'd wash you down, and then next, and you'd come and stand in there, and Grandma would wash you, and then the last one would wash you down. And then Grandma would take that water out and put it on the flower beds. And the house that they have in Rexburg had problems because when she would do her dishes, she used a pan in the sink. She wouldn't just fill the sink with water and do the dishes and let it run out. And they had problems with the sink. She called the plumber one day, and the plumber came up and said, lady, the sink hasn't had anything run through it. It's full of debris that's been sitting there forever. What do you do with your water? Well, I put it on the flowers out behind the house. So it was just the way she was raised.
This house is for Sona, right?
Really,
Grandpa Dave's house.
I'd like to go through it.
I would too.
Just to walk in and say, I'm
For
sorry,
sale
when
a
I was
couple
this
days ago.
size, I used to run around in this house. The other one is,
Which house is it?
It's 2 houses down.
Yeah, do you even know which house it is? Do you know which house was Yowsie's house.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
right to the
To the
immediate,
north.
the
Down,
immediate
down the
north.
hill. The
It's
red
kind of
brick.
like has a hill that rounds up and it's white with red brick on it and
Yep.
a tree.
And there's a barn out behind it. Okay,
Might be fun to
So
look
tell
over.
them what we grew up with for water for our baths.
you tell 'em.
So, that's how my dad was raised. So when we lived in a very nice home in Rexburg with running hot water, we bathed in water, maybe like so.
6 inches of water.
And
That's too much. Mom would say 3 inches.
Oh, really?
3 inches is all you need.
wow. Yeah, and you use the same towel for a week and
You got
or
clean.
dry off with
What are
a
you talking
washcloth.
about?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and showering was
Oh,
no showers.
I started taking long showers and I got ripped out.
Yeah.
Although I got talked to real fast.
I came home one time from working in the potatoes like after midnight and it was snowing and you're frozen. You
want
guys
some-
know.
Yeah,
And got in the shower and got chastised the next morning.
got
Oh,
comfortable. and-
wow.
Yeah, the house had one bathroom, 6 kids, plus mom and dad, with one bathroom, 4 girls in one room.
In folds. 2 girls in a full bed.
Yeah,
Not even queen. Right?
just,
No,
well, he had
no
it special
holes.
made, but it fit, the whole width of the room right there. All those
Anyway.
girls in there.
It just spilled over. The
Yeah.
frugalities spilled over.
So there's Grandma and Grandpa in Rexburg out behind that house
Yeah, out behind that house.
with that
There's
cow.
that barn's still there.
And that barn, yeah. As a kid, I'd go out in the loft and jump out down into the hay and everything else with that one. Okay, one of the curses of living out here was what do you do in the summer? In the winter when we don't have anything to do. So Grandpa was a part-time carpenter and they would go to California. A couple of years they went to California and down San Bernardino. And there he would do odd jobs for people. This was during the Depression, during the 30s. And because there was no money, $1 a day was what you worked for. He says, I've seen fights outside the elevators there in Rexburg of guys who wanted to go in and work. And they just have 30 guys standing there and there was a fist fight until one guy was standing and he'd walk in and the guy'd say, you're hired for $1 a day. The rest of you guys, bye, see you tomorrow. You can fight it out again then. So they went to California looking like the Jodes. Now that isn't a picture of them, but that's typical. They said they piled everything that they had. Grandpa had a Model T Ford, and they piled everything that they owned onto that car and drove slowly all the way to California. And because there was no room for anything, Dad, I think it was Dad, sat on Grandma's lap the whole time, and as a result pinched a nerve in her leg, which bothered her the rest of her life. She just,
Or sciatic.
a lot of gimpy leg, yeah, just her sciatic got pinched permanently. But that was what they did. Okay, while they're in California that year, 30 whatever it is, it's in the 30s, is when Grandpa got baptized in the ocean by Alexander Schreiner, if you know who that is.
They won't.
He's the tabernacle organist during my whole youth. He was like 30 years, the organist in Salt Lake,
And what was he doing in California?
a missionary. He was young at that point.
So was he taught the gospel in California in the summer?
I think by osmosis from Grandma and her family.
Oh, that's right.
But they never pushed, and Grandpa was never a bishop. He was never a scriptorian. Nobody did the scriptures. Even when I was this age, nobody did scriptures. We didn't have the Book of Mormon until the 90s, when Benson pushed it. But my mission, Book of Mormon, whatever. Joseph Smith's story was it. In France, you talked about the Bible, but the Book of Mormon was Looney Tunes. That was just, real hard sell to do anything like that.
Random question. Jumping back to him being a carpenter.
Yeah.
Do we know if Grandpa Dave's dad, that was from Wells,
Was a carpenter. Yes, that's where he learned his skill.
He was a carpenter.
Uh-huh.
Because the fact that Grandpa Dave went on to be a builder and built this house and then went on to be a builder in the valley.
They built small homes. I think his dad had done that. My grandpa's dad, the original from Wales.
Okay.
And so he knew those skills. But building big stuff wasn't until my dad came along.
Okay.
Dad was the push.
Well, the educated one.
Yeah, and he had Grandma on his side. So Dad, okay, quick story on Dad. This is in the 40s. Dad is going to school at the University of Idaho in 42, 43, and the war is on. And so he got an exemption to finish his degree because he was a civil engineer. And they wanted that in the Army. He wanted to be an architect, but drawing plans, and you should have seen how you made blueprints in those days, he ruined his eyes. Dad's eyes were never good after that. He had a hard time, he squinted a lot. Not to mention the fact that he drove into the sun both ways when he was working in Driggs. Drive in the morning sun, drive home in the afternoon sun. Dad's eyes were not good, and that was one of the reasons why. So he goes into engineering instead of being an architect. And he said to his dad, okay, we're going to expand the business. And I'm sure Grandpa said, they did. And the first one that they built was the gymnasium on West Main in Rexburg, that big white building that sits on the north side of the road. That was the high school gym
Kind
of
of
the
the
day.
gray flat roof.
Yeah. I remember playing in the basement of that thing when they first got the bid and were going to clean it out, and away they go. They built that and were successful, and the next one was the hospital. So the
Which
hospital
is now torn down.
at the end of, well, the hospital at the end of Main Street was built by Dad. And then it exploded from there. They did all the churches, the stake centers. Dad built, 18 buildings on campus. It got to the point that Salt Lake, it finally got to the point. Dad was so doggone honest, just squeaky honest. And they knew that they just gave him a contract 1 year for the next building. He says, Dick, just build it. Add 6% for your fee, send us the bill. We trust you. That lasted one building. And then the other guys screamed bloody murder and says, you can't do that. You got to have bids. You got to go through that whole process. So it went back to normal again. But that's how my father was known, as being incredibly honest. Incredibly honest. There's the family. There's the family. There's 4 kids. One died. And so Grandma's the first
Where did
batch.
Grandpa get his height?
Good off the mother side, off the Smoots.
Smoot side?
Yeah, the Beans.
Smoot was tall.
Yeah.
Abraham Owen Smoot?
How
But you look at that picture. Dad's the only one that's tall.
There's a different picture on Grandpa Dave's, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you put it back, but it's all of them, and then Grandpa.
And then there's
over here.
Dad. Yeah. There's a picture that I took. That I'm in. I'm right over here. But that's of the farm. We were up here at the farm one day. But
This
that's,
is you, Rick?
yeah, with my back to the camera. But
And this is here?
that's at the building down here.
Wow.
And that was taken in, the date's on the top, I think.
1950.
50. Okay. So,
What year were you born, Rick?
43.
43.
Okay, that's a wrap.
Tell us one negative trait that you saw ever.
About what?
There's no negatives.
These people were can-do. They never said no. They had so many hardships. I mean, can you imagine? Okay, Dad, as a young boy, this age, his dad would take him up here to the farm, leave him for a week. He brought him up on Sunday night and left him there. He would have to walk in all the way from Canyon Creek to here
I'm sorry, when he was 12?
when he was 12, and then all through his teenage years. And Grandpa would come up on Saturday afternoon and pick him up, drive back to Rexburg. Dad would get a bath, get a blah-da-da-da-da, and he'd be brought back the next day, and he'd spend another week up here. So my dad grew up incredibly alone, which is why he was always a loner. You know how that was.
And
Dad,
what did he do while he was up here
Plowed.
on the farm?
he just plowed.
And can you tell me where where did they cross Canyon Creek?
Clear down, as right at the first as you're coming in. As you cross the river bridge and you take a right, there's that big house that's right there.
Stevens's house?
Uh-huh.
Okay, with
You
the
take
Quonsets and-
you take a look, and it goes down right there.
Okay.
There's kind of an old road down in there, it looks
That's
like.
Oh,
it.
so it was just a little to the south of the bridge then.
Yes, there was no bridge.
Okay.
Okay, story on that. So Grandpa would have, let's say, 2 wagon loads of wheat to take into St. Anthony.
Yeah.
That's weight, that's heavy, that's money. And so he had 8 horses that he'd hitch, and he'd take the 2 wagons all the way down to the grade right there, take them down to the bottom, and then take 8 horses, pull the wagon to the top, unhitch them, go back down, pull the other one clear to the top, hitch up the remaining 4, and the other 4 he'd turn loose and they just walk back
They
up
come
here to
back
the barn.
here.
They knew where home was. And then he'd drive those wagons into St. Anthony. But he said that going up the west side was the hard part because it was switchbacks.
Rick, have you had any contact with any of the family from
No,
Ohio? We have no connections
nothing,
to those.
none. Because he had a brother who was here, you know, out in Parker.
Hugh or a different brother?
I don't know. It was, I honestly can't tell you who and what happened, but they had nothing to do with each other.
Oh, they had a falling out.
I don't know that. I don't know why there wasn't, because he was never close to a brother. He never talks about spending time with his brother.
This
you
is
know,
David?
This is your
Yeah,
grandpa?
this is right. Yeah, this is Dave.
And it was Hugh who he followed out here?
Yes,
And that's the brother you're referring to?
I think. I'm not even sure of that.
That's why we need to make a quick trip to Seattle before he's gone.
See what
If you
Bud
look
has to
on
say.
Family Search and the siblings of David Davis, you'll see one that was in St. Anthony, I
Yeah.
think died in St. Anthony.
Yeah, there was.
But
Yeah.
We've
yeah,
done some of the work for that family.
yeah. But yeah, that's,
Okay. Well, I just wondered if there was any connections to Ohio or family.
The only Ohio connection was old girlfriends. And just family who glommed onto, not even family, just friends who had an excuse for an Idaho vacation. And it drove Grandma nuts. Because they'd have some family that'd come all the way out from Ohio and expect to spend 3-4 weeks living here on the farm and have Grandma doing all the washing, doing the cooking and everything else. Thank you very much.
take them to Yellowstone.
That would drive, you know, yeah, the Yellowstone trip. Well, first story about wash. You can imagine washing. It was with a washboard. It was literally with a tub and an old washboard. And these ladies would hand them all, Grandma, all this stuff and say thank you, and then turn around and walk away. It got her. Because like I say, she's not a housewife at all.
So what are your memories of Grandma Margaret? Like, do you have memories with her?
Oh yeah, she was the secretary for Davis Construction. Dad
Did she
was the
ever pick you
brains.
up? Did you ever hold you? Do you ever remember being on her lap reading a
Never,
book or a
never,
story?
never.
Telling a story?
Never,
No affection.
none,
Okay.
nothing overt. But I'll caution that was that generation.
Yeah, for sure.
My dad never in his life put his arm around me, never. He shook my hand twice. Once when I went on a mission, once when I went in the Army. I was on the plane. I was in Idaho Falls. I was headed out to Vietnam, got on the plane, and I'm sure Mom kicked him hard and said, "You go say goodbye."
He was, how old was I? What year is that?
This would have been 67.
Anyway, we're at the airport, and I remember Dad, who didn't get emotional, getting emotional.
In Idaho Falls Airport?
Uh-huh. When Rick walked out on that plane, walked across the tarmac to the plane.
Mm.
I don't remember anybody saying anything, but it was like this could be the last time I see my son.
Yeah. The plane loaded from the rear. It was one of those with a stairway that came down underneath the tail. And I was in halfway up on the left-hand side, sitting on the aisle. And all of a sudden, I feel somebody and turn around, there's Dad. Shook my hand and turned around and walked out.
That was quite a bit for him. I mean, it was.
And that's what I'm saying. It was not a generation of overt emotions. Nobody did.
Except for my dad.
And that's why when I met him the first time, it blew me away.
Because what did he do?
Oh
Did he
my
kiss you on the
gosh.
cheek?
He tried. He came to the front door,
You
opened the
listen to this,
door and
John?
said, "Rick, my boy," and jumped at and grabbed me, and I went boom, just like that. About broke his heart. I said, "You don't touch me. I don't know you from a load of logs, you know." Good grief. Ugh, that was it. He's a great guy, don't get me wrong, but it was just something I wasn't used to at all. Not at all.
Had to
So,
get
so
used
grandma
Well, even
rarely cooked. My grandma Josie was the cook.
Right.
Grandma was the one where you could go up and hang onto her side, and she had a girdle. It was just like grabbing a tree. I remember those vertical slats in that thing, and that was just hard. But that was Grandma.
She had hernias.
And yeah, among other. And but Grandma Davis, never. I don't ever remember cookies. I don't ever remember a cake. My only food was Grandpa liked cheese, and I blame him for my love of cheese. Because when I was a munchkin like that, he'd sit down at the table. His favorite meal was buttermilk and green onions.
Oh my goodness.
Glass of buttermilk and eat little green onions, and that was just, boy, that was the best thing at the end of the day.
I
And some
remember
sharp
Grandma
cheese.
just sitting in the living room with her calculator.
Yes, or the kitchen table, not
Or
even the living
Oh yeah,
room.
it was the kitchen table.
It was a round table,
And she always
a
had
10-key calculator, that's all, with a
tape
handle.
on her fingers because her hands were so dry that
Yes.
they were split.
They'd split. And she'd put just a
Must have
piece
had
of
some eczema or something.
white adhesive tape around the end. Well, and it was the soap that she used too. She made her own soap.
Lye, so-
I watched her make lye soap out in the backyard, put it in a cookie pan and cut it into bars.
Yeah.
And then it'd dry and kind of curl up on the ends and separate. But
Yeah.
that stuff really cleaned, but it really cleaned.
Dr. Passy would say, you have dishwater hands.
Yeah.
Use ivory.
It was rough,
That's what he told me.
really rough on your hand, but boy did it clean. So,
Have you guys got any questions? Well, we've got somebody here who.
So what was the time frame that this was owned until it was sold? Or
30s, in the 30s is when Grandpa finally, they had 7 years of lost it all due to storms.
okay,
October coming up and there's everything ready to be harvested and here came a thunderstorm. And the
Hail.
hail had hit and boom, there went the whole crop.
wow.
Next year will be okay. And I heard 5 years. I read the other day it was 7, whatever. But Grandma looked at him and says, Dave, we're done. But Margaret, Dave, we're done. And they went back down to Rexburg and he became a carpenter full time.
How old was Grandpa
When they did that, this would have been in the 30s. So he's born in 85. So 30, 40, 45. He was still, but he built the original Madison County Library. No longer stands, it went with the flood, but it was a substantial building down where the fire station is now.
So right across from the new library.
Kind of across from the tabernacle.
Yeah, across from the tabernacle. So, okay. Anything else?
Thank you.
That give you
Yeah, that was awesome.
give you some background on where I came from and therefore where you come from and a little bit of your pioneer heritage.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I'm hoping within just this is on the Tibet side, but this is pretty cool. Our heritage from Tibet side comes from Switzerland, a little town, a little parish called Kutigen Aargau in Switzerland. And our grandpa, our great grandpa equal, came to Arco, Idaho. He just left, came to Arco of all places is
All
where
places.
that's where he ended up. And
That's the antithesis of Switzerland.
I know exactly.
No
Right,
kidding.
It's gonna be the most opposite of Switzerland. So then his son is my grandma's dad.
Okay.
Anyway, I was doing some history the other day and saw that there was a new name attached. All these records from Switzerland have finally started coming through. So I emailed this lady and I didn't know. I just said, I'm not sure who you are, but I'm curious how you're related to the Blattner. So anyway, this is of this generation, 2 generations back. Our great-great-grandfather came to Arco. Her great-great-grandfather, they were brothers, and her great-great-grandfather went to France, so they're all French. And so just the gathering is happening,
Interesting.
and so it's cool to see, like, you know, at some point, some connection in Ohio, we'll get to know more about, you know, some of our history that
Yeah,
way. I'm
yeah.
hoping.
I think it's even cool that she lives so close to where the Pincocks homesteaded. I mean,
True.
she's like a mile,
True.
maybe a mile.
Just on the other side of the river, kind
yeah,
of.
just on
Yep.
the other side of the river.
When people give me grief from being from South Fremont, I said, hey, we are the original Sugar City family.
That's right. Don't give me any grief.
Give me any grief. Don't give cougars grief anyway.
Here, Chair.